Today, we're going to be looking at the concept of new imperialism. So, the idea here being that the United States is looking at territories abroad now instead of just focusing on westward expansion. And so, what does that really mean for the United States in this new 20th century era? Before we can look at imperialism in this period, we need to recap what the United States policy was before this. Going back to Washington's farewell address, we have particularly been leaning towards a neutral stance and relatively isolated. Washington advocated avoiding entangling European alliances. And so as a young country, that was our goal, to not get embroiled in another war. We may not be strong enough to survive another one. And then later on, President James Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine in the early 1800s. By the 1820s, 1830s, and then here we are advocating now that Europeans need to stay out of the Americas, both North and South America, after these various colonies getting their independence from them are closed to the Europeans, and they need to see their way out, so to speak. The idea, of course, the United States still being focused on westward expansion, heading across the continent itself, and finishing that sea to shining sea mindset of, in some ways, conquering, or at least, let's say, settling. During the Civil War itself, we start to become slightly more aggressive, especially after the war, asserting our dominance a little bit more. For example, in the 1860s, Secretary of State William Seward, that's pictured here to the right, is probably one of the stronger Secretary of States we've seen since probably John Quincy Adams in that Monroe administration, who helped issue the Monroe Doctrine. Secretary of State William Seward in the war itself is key in trying to keep France and Britain away from the Confederates and the Confederates getting European support. Not only that, it's shortly after the war that Seward helps to kick out a French force that had tried to take over parts of Mexico, seeing that the United States may not be able to enforce that Monroe Doctrine. It's actually a force led by Napoleon's nephew, so the Napoleons somehow are still under the scene. Seward also advocates for the purchase of Alaska. We buy Alaska for about $7 million. Initially seen as quote-unquote Seward's folly or his icebox, because no one really thinks it's worth anything. Later on, of course, by the turn of the century into the 1900s, we find out that Alaska has oil and gold reserves. So that looks like an awesome purchase now from the Russians. Also leads for the annexation of Midway Island in the Pacific, and eventually will put telegraph cables through Midway, and will eventually be helpful for our growing United States Navy as well. Through the Gilded Age itself, our country is focused on industrial growth. We're kind of focused more inward, but we are growing in terms of trade abroad because we're becoming such a huge hub of manufacturing that increases our economic influence abroad. So we are starting to assert ourselves more in the world, especially now that the country is through the Civil War and is, no longer fighting amongst itself, so to speak. And then we're starting to build up our Navy, and that will especially be prevalent in the early 1900s, which is what we're about to look at. So why? Why does the United States start to become an imperial threat like others? Well, one, if you look abroad, it provides cheap natural resources. By taking over other areas, it will be able to basically extort those areas for their natural resources, similar to what we had done as we continue to expand west. With the West being closed, now we want to find new markets and new areas to get those resources. That leads to the markets as well. As if we take over other areas, that's places that we can automatically sell our goods, which will lead then to colonies equal more power, thinking back to what we've seen even from the early American colonial period. We know the frontier is over. We know the West is closed, so now we're looking elsewhere. Panic of 1893, the populist unrest among the people, with what Frederick Jackson Turner kind of said, do we need a new safety valve now? Because if all these people are frustrated with government, frustrated with abuses by railroads or other business ventures, then what are they going to do? Well, then they could seek to head to these new colonies, these new areas that will take over. Now we talked about social Darwinism, and the Darwinist theory is also going to apply internationally. So we're looking at the idea of the survival of the fittest nation. Political cartoon pictured here to the right just kind of showcases American eagle, Russian bear, so on and so forth. And the idea there that who is going to be able to conquer these specific areas, and what country is strongest and deserves the most colonies, thereby power. The idea that your industrial might is one of the reasons why you are stronger than others. And then finally, this international Darwinism even promotes a racial hierarchy that your race, your nation is superior because of its bloodline. That especially promotes a very, very tense ideology, which will lead to both World War I and World War II in a lot of ways. So who is advocating for imperialism at this time? So let's look at a couple different features of it. First off, you've got Alfred Mahan, who's going to write an influential text called The Influence of Sea Power on History. And he basically talks about that if you control the seas, that you control then more military might and more economic power overall. That the seas are the most important piece. And so he is widely read among Europeans and among Americans at this time. And people that advocate for a stronger Navy point to his work, talk about how sea power equals global power. And so we're going to seek to increase the power of our Navy as a result of books like his. Reverend Josiah Strong references the civilizing mission in the book Our Country, how that it is the not necessarily God-given right, but it's the burden or the responsibility to civilize others outside of the United States. We've already kind of seen what that civilizing mission might look like with Native Americans and this quote-unquote white man's burden. White man's burden we talk about in world history as well, but it's the idea being that these European ancestral peoples, whether they be English, French, American, whatever, have an opportunity to take over other areas and help bring quote-unquote civilization to them to better their society. Politicians, particularly Republicans, are going to support imperialism. The two most famous from this period that we'll mention these gentlemen a lot more later on will be Theodore Roosevelt, pictured there to the right, and then in the bottom right corner, Henry Cabot Lodge, who is a famous Republican senator during this time frame. So the idea being that as the United States expands abroad, we will have a strong American world presence, and by having a strong American world presence, we will then be able to dominate, whether it be on sea or on land. Not only that, we know that the popular press will play a key role in this, as the press had played a key role in our previous age. This whole idea of yellow journalism, especially getting us involved in the Spanish-American War, is important. Your journalists, the Hearst, the Pulitzers, are some of the reasons why the United States is involved in the Spanish-American War, because of these sensationalist headlines via yellow journalism. That's what we're going to stop at for the day, and we will pick back up in class.